venturing into that part of the history of philosophy that follows Plato and Aristotle. And again, we have a similar kind of situation that we had after Parmenides and Heraclitus. So if you recall, we have the Ionians and the Italians, and they cannot agree. And there's a period that you could call a philosophical impasse. It seems that nobody can get the right answer because the most brilliant people in the world fundamentally disagree as to what the right answer is. And so after that, we have a period of skepticism, and the dominant philosophical school in Greece during this period of skepticism, these people are called the what? What's the dominant school? Josiah. In Greece, after Parmenides and Heraclitus and the Ionians and Italians cannot agree, we have a period dominated by the...
Well, there's two.
Okay, give me either one.
The sophists.
Sophists is one. That's good. That's what I was looking for. What's the other one? What's the other one you were thinking of?
The Cynics.
Okay, the Cynics, sure. Right. Much Diogenes really is kind of in a class by himself, but yeah, you do have those. But mainly, we think of the Sophists, who are skeptical. They don't think there is a right answer, and they don't care. When people cannot resolve the big questions, the issues they wrestle with become much, much smaller. Silly, little, trivial things like, how can I be happy? How can I get rich? How can I win friends and influence people? How can I just get along in life? Who cares about great overarching themes of being and, all these huge philosophies? Who cares? I just want to have a happy life here. And I'm not going to worry about that stuff. And that was really what the Sophists did. And they learned the fine art of manipulating people through speech. Until along comes a guy who says, no, I think we can answer these questions. And his name is Plato. And Plato mostly takes his cue from Parmenides, but tips his hat to Heraclitus. He's mostly concerned about Parmenides' world of being, ideals, but he grants that there is this world of change that Heraclitus had mentioned, so he has his receptacle world. Do you see? He sort of synthesizes Parmenides and Heraclitus, puts them together, and gives us a new philosophy called Platonism, which is mostly tilting toward this kind of rationalism, but allows for a world of change, so on. All right, so that's Plato. And of course, everybody thinks, wow, Plato's really got a handle on things, till along comes his most famous student, Aristotle, who just does about the opposite. Except that in Aristotle's philosophy now, the tilt is toward the world of Heraclitus. What is it that you see in Aristotle that tells you he is more inclined toward that, sort of Ionian Heraclitus outlook? What is it in Aristotle that tells you that? This would be a time for you to play, participate. What is it in the philosophy, generally speaking, of Aristotle that tells you he's more interested in the world as painted by Heraclitus than the world as painted by Parmenides? Connect dots, please, Krista.
I think his explanation of the substance and accidents were similar to Heraclitus, thinking that everything's in flux and it's always changing, and there's nothing that stays the same.
All right, that's good. Alicia?
I think he believed that Plato doesn't really use correct language in his thought
He didn't
process.
like his language, that's right.
But I think it's more of an actuality, potentiality.
Yeah.
Feel more
Okay.
just a higher form.
All right. Those are both kind of pointing in the right direction. Megan?
His God, like being the sun, and he can't help that he only notices himself.
Yeah.
It's kind of like,
Well, what do you see in Heraclitus that...
well, everything's changing, and so this God really has
Oh,
no
okay.
control.
Okay, all right, okay. Yeah. All right, those are all good, pointing in the right direction. The main thing to notice about Aristotle is how preoccupied he is with change. You know, really, his whole philosophy is about causation, change. How does it happen? How do you measure it? What does it look like? All of those categories, really, are measures of change: quantity, quality, time, place, action, passion, all of that stuff. You know, in other words, he's the philosopher that wants to turn change as a philosophical idea into a science. And that's what scientists do. They want to measure it. They want to understand it. They want to see what causes what, you know. Plato doesn't care so much about that. It's not so much on his radar. So, Aristotle, if I could put it, this is very simplistic and I'm sure wrong, but okay. I would say Plato is about 75. Did I say this the other day? I probably gave you a different statistic, so you know. I would say Plato is about 75% Parmenides and 25% Heraclitus. I would say Aristotle is about 75% Heraclitus, you know, and 25% Parmenides. They both are synthesizing, but they synthesize with a different tilt in each case. And now we have the same problem. Now all of a sudden, everybody's sitting around going, you know, I've never met anybody more brilliant than Aristotle, except for his teacher Plato. You know, both these guys are geniuses. When I listen to Plato, he persuades me. I read his dialogues, and I think, yeah, that's got to be the right answer. And then I bump into Aristotle, and when I listen to him for a while, I go, no, he's got to have the right answer. And I think to myself, I'm never going to figure this out. You know? And so what happens? What happens when you have two great thinkers who don't agree? What happens? It's called a philosophical impasse, and we enter into a period of... Stephen, what's the answer to my question? We enter into a period of... Similar to this period, it's a period of...
Called an impasse.
An impasse. We got an impasse here. Plato and Aristotle cannot agree, and that creates a period of...
conflict.
Mamma mia. Yes, Sarah, a period of... Skepticism. Do you read me? Skepticism follows philosophical impasse. Get that in your brains. All right, we're going to see it again and again and again. It's going to happen all the way down through our studies of philosophy. We're going to have great thinkers who differ, and in the shadow of their, Stephen, conflict, we get skepticism. Skepticism means I don't think anybody knows the right answer. Y'all with me on that? Next time I ask this question, you're all going to put your hands up and say together, as if in a Gregorian chant, skepticism. You know, you're going to get it. Right? All right. Now, the earlier period of skepticism produces the sophists and the cynics. All right, as we said. This period also produces skeptical philosophies. Not the same ones, but they share in common with the earlier ones that idea that there's no ultimate answers. The two philosophies that dominate this era, I'm talking about roughly from the year 300 all the way down to about 100 AD, all right, into the beginning of the Christian era. For about 400 years, There are two philosophies that dominate, and they both represent that kind of a skeptical outlook. And those two philosophies are... Oh, somebody make my day. Go ahead, Mr. Dupree.
I think one is Epicurean.
That is exactly right. I am so excited. And if that is it, then the other one has to be, Jacob, Stoicism. These are, by the way, as you probably know, the only two pagan philosophies that are ever mentioned in the New Testament. Where do we run into the reference to the Stoics and the Epicureans in the New Testament? Where do those names pop up? Only once. I think you see kind of maybe implied allusions to them in other places in the New Testament, but only once are they specifically mentioned, and that is where? Anybody know? Josiah, where did it happen?
Acts 17.
Acts 17 is correct. I do want you to know this. Actually, I really do want you to know it, because you were there. You were on Mars Hill at the very place where Paul gave his sermon to the Stoics and the Epicureans in Athens, Greece. In the shadow of the Parthenon, at the Areopagus, and it's in Acts chapter 17. So this is one point where we have a very clear intersection of philosophical history and biblical history. It's one of the more interesting ones. But anyway, these are the people. They've been around for some time, for hundreds of years actually. And I want to just give you a quick sketch of what they were about. So, we'll take the Epicureans first. Epicureanism is founded by a guy named, cleverly enough, Epicurus. Epicurus, E-P-I-C-U-R-U-S, Epicurus. Epicurus lives 340 to 270 in round numbers. So it's right at the beginning then of what's called the age of Hellenism. Alexander the Great dies in 323, when this guy is about 10 years old or something. A teenager or something. Epicurus followed the philosophy of Democritus. He thought the guy that got the right answer was that pre-Socratic by the name of Democritus. Why do you suppose? Well, I'll put it this way. If you embrace the philosophy of Democritus, then what kind of answers do you think you would come up with in terms of the meaning of life? Who remembers Democritus? Go ahead. Sydney?
Well, Democritus was a heathenist, and so he would answer basically the meaning of life is pleasure.
Okay, that's the idea. Democritus was a kind of hedonist. He didn't really focus on that as much, but he was a materialist. He was an atomist. Remember that? Everything is just a chance, random collision of particles. That's all. You are just the product of a series of accidents. It has produced you, accident has brought you into being, accident is going to usher you out of being. That's it. You are accidental. Everything that you think gives meaning to your life is just an illusion. There was a song written by somebody. It'll come to me. But anyway, it was popular when I was about your age. I was in college. And the title of the song was Dust in the Wind. Was it Kansas? I think that's right, yeah. Dust in the Wind. It's nice to listen to. It's kind of gentle music. But the philosophy of the music is what? You know the song, Ben? What's the philosophy of the song?
It's all we are is dust in the wind.
Yeah, and so what's the point of that?
Nothing really matters.
Now, the point of that is there is no point. How much meaning is there to a little bit of dust just blowing in the wind? And that's you. You're just so much dust in the wind. And so, if that's the case, if Democritus is right, and Epicurus thought he was, then really this whole business of trying to answer the great questions is nonsense. Why bother? The only thing that really makes sense is to, at least in some sense or other, try to make the best of it during this fleeting phantom existence that you have for a brief period of time before you disintegrate into nothingness. And so from his point of view, you should, just try to enhance your enjoyment of life. You should find pleasure in modest amounts, but you should avoid pain. You should do those two. The influences on Democritus were, first of all, an earlier group called the Cyrenaics. The Cyrenaics is spelled Cyrenaics. The Cyrenaics. Cyrenaics. The founder of the Cyrenaics was a guy named Aristippus. Aristipus. Aristippus. Aristipus. I'm saying this is one of the influences on Democritus. He's influenced by, on Epicurus. He's influenced by Democritus. He's influenced by Aristippus. Okay, Aristippus was a contemporary of Socrates, and he was what's called a crass hedonist. His belief was the only thing that matters is pleasure, and you should give yourself over to the pursuit of pleasure with gusto. So he was of that school of thought that said, you find the best food you can find, and you gorge yourself, you eat it until you're literally sick, and then what do? You puke, and then what do? You do it again. So these were the crass, hedonistic, so-called Cyrenaic philosophers that were in Athens at the time of Socrates in the Golden Age. They didn't have a majority following. Socrates despised them. But nevertheless, there were those out there who said that's all that makes sense. That influenced Epicurus, but Epicurus noticed something about these Cyrenaics that troubled him. And it came to be called in history the hedonistic paradox. Which I've talked about before, and I think you have an idea what it is. So Nicole, if I just said, what in the world is this hedonistic paradox? You would brilliantly answer what?
It's that you're pursuing pleasure, but it still doesn't make you happy.
It's more poignant than that. That is true. But the hedonistic paradox really says what, Alicia?
So much pleasure that you acquire pain.
That's right. The pursuit of pleasure will always become painful, sooner or later. If you set your heart on pursuing pleasure, you will wind up in pain. In my own experience, the best examples I've ever encountered of that principle would be the guys that I went to college with my freshman year. And I don't think much has changed. I think it's generally a male attitude the first year in college. None of you, of course. I know you are above this. But depending on where you go to college, you will encounter this philosophy. Guys, they get out from under home, out from under the restraints of domestic, forces that are going to keep them. And what do they want to do every weekend? They want to go out and get drunk. They just want to give themselves over to this sort of nonstop party mentality. So they go to classes during the week and they just live for the weekend when they're going to go out and just, give themselves in this kind of hedonistic bash. How many times did I wake up to the wonderful sound of vomiting at about 2 a.m. when these guys would come back to the dorm? I don't know, many times. Boy, that sounds like fun. Whoa, man. Tell you. Wow. I wish I weren't a Christian. I could go out and do that too. You can think about these things. That was one of the greatest deterrents for me to hedonism, was seeing these poor guys with splitting headaches the next day. I mean, they didn't look good. They just looked bad, You couldn't whisper to them, "Oh, not so loud." They're just kind of... Well, now, if you want to prove this to your own satisfaction, I suppose you can do it. No one's going to be there to prevent it. But if you want to learn from the wisdom of the ages, then let me just say it to you. If you set your heart on the pursuit of pleasure, if you say that's all I'm going to worry about, it'll become painful. You will pay more out in pain than you got in pleasure. Always. And Epicurus figured that out. It didn't take a Christian conscience to figure that out. All it took was an IQ above 50 to figure that out. And so Epicurus decides to himself that while he agrees with the fundamental outlook that all that matters is pleasure, pursuit of pleasure, avoiding pain, he wants to make it vastly more sophisticated. And so he raises the bar considerably. And Epicureanism is a very sophisticated, subtle balance in your pursuit of pleasure. He would look with disdain on my freshman male college guys. He would simply say they are idiots, which generally they were. So when he says you pursue pleasure, he puts that at a much more sophisticated level. And I don't know what to say about that. I don't want to spend too much more time on it except to say this. If you read Epicurus, you begin to realize that he puts the pursuit of pleasure in places where you might not have expected it. He, for example, he advocates celibacy sexually. He says, that's way too scary, way too dangerous. Just stay away from that. So basically the whole sexual thing is not part of his plan. Drinking, only in the most modest amounts. He says the real pleasure you're going to get is from the sort of feeding of the mind and the soul. So he says find pleasure in friendships, modest, in fact almost Spartan amounts of food. If you watched him, you'd think the guy was some kind of medieval monk. You'd think he was, kind of ascetic, because he lived such a restricted life. Always careful, just enough pleasure that it never ran the risk of becoming painful, you see. But it's a very strange thing, isn't it? He lived, we think of Epicureanism, if you have any impression at all of that, as somebody that's sort of out there living for the moment and go for the gusto and all of this, and that really wasn't Epicurus, nor was it his instruction. He was much more disciplined in his pursuit of it. So anyway, that gives you the idea. Some of the people in history that have claimed to be Epicureans, interestingly, include Thomas Jefferson, Denis Diderot. Who is that? Anybody know that name? Diderot, D-I-D-E-R-O-T. Anybody know that name? Ever heard of that? Diderot? He's one of the most famous Enlightenment characters in France. He wrote the first encyclopedia. You know, you ever covered that? You ever covered that anywhere? You didn't cover that last year in modern European history? All right. Friedrich Nietzsche. Ayn Rand. You know her? Atlas Shrugged. And others. So he's had some staying power down through history. All right, so that's Epicurus. Comments, questions about that? I want to jump over and talk a little bit about Stoicism. Go ahead.
So, do you think that a God-fearing Christian could be an Epicurist? Like, is there any belief that kind of contradicts Scripture?
Well, yes, the whole cosmology contradicts Scripture,
right.
You know. I think your more narrow question is, to what degree can a Christian kind of appreciate the pleasurable things in life? My short answer to that is I think a Christian is in a much better position to enjoy pleasurable things than Epicurus ever dreamt. There is this kind of philosophy, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. And the idea that God has created a good world in which we can, with relish, appreciate the things that God has provided for us, I think is fundamental to a Christian ethic, you know. The danger is that when my desire for these pleasurable things moves into that subtle area of a kind of idolatry of them, then I become susceptible to all the bad things that the hedonistic paradox presents. Does that make sense? So it's like Paul says, I think Paul probably puts it best. He says, I know how to abound and I know how to be abased. So the Apostle Paul had a little experience with both. He had times in his life when he could live in some abundance. You know, he wasn't always shipwrecked. He wasn't always a day and a night in the sea. He wasn't always shivering in the cold. You know, he did have moments when life was probably okay. Not many, by his own recounting of it, but certainly those moments. But he never got so fixated on those good things that might come along that he was not at any moment willing to lose them with equal joy and composure. So he'd learned in whatever state he was to be content. You know, if you have achieved something of what seems to be a biblical notion of contentment, then it's going to make the good things that you experience truly delicious, but the loss of them is not going to be overly painful, you know, because your treasure is really in a different place. Does that make sense? I think that's, you know, so a Christian can have a little bit of that Epicurean appreciation of pleasure, even more than Epicurus, I think, would have allowed, but not necessarily get sucked into the dark side of it. I hope that's responsive. That's a great question. I hope I did it justice there. All right. Let's talk about Stoicism for a minute. The main character associated with Stoicism is the second of two Zenos that we study in this class. The first one was a Zeno associated with what philosopher? It was? Jordan, where did we come across Zeno in our earlier studies of Philosophia? The first Zeno we looked at was connected with the philosopher.
I know it, but I can't remember.
Laura, who was it? Parmenides. And of course, the way you recall that, Jordan, is by virtue of Zeno's what? Zeno's famous? Paradoxes or paradoxi. I don't know how you say it. Wow. So that's the first Zeno. Unrelated to the second Zeno, this is the Zeno of Ilium. Then there's a second Zeno, the Zeno of Citium, which is where he was from. And he is the founder of Stoicism. And he founds this particular philosophy in the year 308 in Athens. I think I neglected to mention, by the way. Okay, sorry. Just put a pause button here. We're going to go back to Epicurus and make this comment. He founded a school in Athens which was called the Garden. I've always liked that, the Garden. It was in the year 306. So it's the third philosophical school in Athens. The first one was blank, the second one was blank, and the third one was the Garden. What were the first two, Avery? I saw your hand in the air. The first one was?
First one was the Academy.
The Academy, very good. That's Plato. And then the second one was?
The other one with the geometry. I keep hearing people whisper or something.
Alicia, what was it? The Lyceum. The one with geometry was Plato, actually. Let none but geometers enter here. That was the Academy, yeah. The Lyceum is the title or the name given to the school founded by Aristotle. And then the Garden, which I've always thought is the loveliest of all. Doesn't that sound like a great name for a school? The Garden. And it kind of goes with Epicurus, this kind of garden place of learning. All right, the fourth school is founded by Zeno, and I don't have a name for it, so I don't know what to call it. The School of the Stoics. Actually, that may be it, because Zeno taught on the porch that you all saw from Mars Hill, if you were half awake. If you're on Mars Hill, at the top of it, and you look off in the distance, not more than a quarter of a mile away, there's this long building with a bunch of columns. It looks like a long, long hall, and that was called a stoa. It was called a porch, and that's where Zeno actually did a lot of his teaching. And because he taught on that long stoa, he came to be called the Stoics, so that's where the name comes from. It means porch. So I don't know, maybe that was what he called it. When I use the term Stoic, what comes to mind? What impression does that arouse in your ever-creative imagination when I use the term Stoic?
I think of someone that doesn't really like to show very many emotions.
Okay, you think of a Stoic attitude is not very emotional. That's very good. That's probably the main thing that pops to mind. You all have that impression? Have you all kind of heard that? This person really stoic. They're going to a painful situation. They're being stoic about it. It means they're not having a meltdown. They're not weeping. They're not showing a great deal of emotion. They're kind of keeping a stiff, solid kind of countenance about them, keeping their emotions under control. That actually is not far from it. But there's several features to Stoicism that we need to know that undergird that. I won't make it through this list, but I will start it. Okay? So these are the 8 features of Stoicism. First one, clear judgment. The Stoics were not so much concerned about keeping their emotions under control. That was less important to the Stoics than that they always were able to exercise clear judgment about what to do. That's kind of a misunderstanding of the Stoics. They were not unemotional people. They could feel emotions, and they didn't deny that emotions are part of life. But what they wanted to do was develop a quality that in Greek is called apatheia. Apatheia. What English word do you suppose we get from the Greek word apatheia? Sydney?
Apathy?
Apathy. What is if I said that somebody is apathetic, what would I be saying about them? Matthew, if someone's apathetic, I'm saying
They don't really care.
they don't care. Is that usually a positive description, to be apathetic?
No.
If I said, Matthew, you were really apathetic today in class, would you take that as a compliment?
No.
No, and I wouldn't say that of you, but so you need to understand that what the Stoics meant by this is something a little different than our impression of apathy, to be unconcerned. What they mean is, because pathos is the Greek word for emotion or passion. Pathos, apathetic, means that you are detached from your emotions. It doesn't mean that you don't have emotions, but it means that you have somehow figured out a way to take a step back so that your emotions are not dictating what you do or the decisions you make. Which means that in the United States of America, probably across the whole country, there may be 2 Stoics, Because there's never been a culture more given to the sort of belief that you make decisions on where your heart leads you. Yes?
Would they label women as like a Stoic or?
Probably most women are incapable of being Stoics. From the Stoic point of view, I'm not speaking personally, I'm just saying from their point of view.
That sounded like your point of
I think the Stoics would say that this is something for which women are genetically they can't even get there from here. But and it was a male-dominated kind of philosophy. Yeah. But the point I want you to get here is this, that the Stoic ideal was to say, I'm feeling emotions, I'm feeling anger, I'm feeling desire, I'm feeling this, I'm feeling that, but I'm going to have the requisite discipline to detach myself from those emotions and make a decision based on pure reason. Who's the most famous character in 20th century kind of media, I guess, who would be the ideal Stoic? Stephen?
It's Mr. Spock.
Spock, of course. Whatever it takes to keep you guys with me. That's just, So that's it. All right. We will continue this a domani. But for now, that will do it.